So let's talk through a powerful unit class in Warhammer 40K, with the fine art of mechanised warfare, delivering your units to the front in style, and all the rules weirdness that goes along with that. Time for some transport tactics in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking general gameplay and transport tactics, with an overview of a set of units that's really quite important for so many factions in the game. In Warhammer 40k, transport vehicles have generally been a staple in 10th edition. Almost every faction has access to at least one of them, with even the Tyranids having their Tyrannosaurus and Harridan. Some of them take a bit more of a prominent role in their factions compared with others, ranging from being absolutely vital or to include, usually down to usable support pieces, though a few of them are a bit on the weak side at the moment. The rules are perhaps one of the more complicated areas of Warhammer 40k as well, and in terms of depth and extra bits to them. There's perhaps a slightly annoying amount of content for transports in the designer's commentary, so for this video I thought we'd do a general overview, talking through why you want transports in the first place, how the rules work including the fine details and weird things that have turned up if Games Workshop have fine-tuned their game, and then a few basic battle tactics for advancing your transports toward the enemy and getting the squads where they need to go. First up, why might you want transport vehicles in your army in the first place? In general, when the transport datasheets are working well, they're usually desired when you want to add speed and durability to your infantry units, which often move 6 inches across the board, and some of the more elite ones can be really quite fragile for the points cost. Maybe a unit like Sisters of Battle Dominions could be a good example. Some fun special weapon fire support, but needs to get close, and if they try and just walk across the board, they're likely to get shot due to having weak defensive profiles for their points. Transport vehicles can be great for any units like that. Even if a transport vehicle adds nothing else beyond that, it can be well worth the value. Say for example, Space Marine and Chaos Rhinos tend to be fairly dedicated and not trying to do other things, but plenty of the vehicles out there also try and add value in other ways, having a bit of damage output with a few big guns mounted, maybe doing some buffing or supporting rules, like say the assault ramp of the Land Raider to be able to move across the board and then drop, or the Hexagon Land Fortress giving you some big wound rerolls to the unit that dropped out. The transport also might have the flexibility of a firing deck as well to allow a unit to fire out the top while embarked, and certain detachments out there are clearly made for transport, things like the Space Marine Firestorm or the Sisters Bringers of Flame having some interesting stratagems. They can say give you boosted damage when you're jumping out of transport, or interesting options with getting back in at unusual times. Then, after their main role is done, they can still be annoying nuisance units after their unit has disembarked. Having tough expendable units is generally pretty handy to have in 40k. They can contest or even score objectives, screen out deep strike or other enemies, or maybe do nuisance charges as and when it makes sense to. They'll generally need a unit to go in them to justify them being included in the army, but if they can do that basic role, they can add a lot of benefits on top of that. Overall, between all that, usually the units that really want that kind of support are things that don't move fast, they're fairly fragile for their points costs, and they don't want to get shot up on the way to the fight, but also needs to get close to deliver their big damage, and for the most part it usually makes sense to have a unit that has a higher points cost than the vehicle that's transporting it, as generally it's not usually going to make sense to spend more points on a unit to allow it to do its role than the actual cost of the unit itself, as otherwise the overall thing might not add up to be enough value. It's a bit different for other transports that can add loads of extra value though, say for example Leaguers of Votan Sagittars mounting big scary guns on the top of them. Fairly reasonable enough as damage dealers on their own right, with their transport capacity making up some of their value but maybe not the majority of it. For example of some units that might enjoy transport to get them from A to B, some common uses at the moment might be things like Plague Marines and Rhinos, very dangerous up close but not as durable as you'd expect to enemy shooting. Drukhari Incubi, maybe jumping out of Venoms or Raiders, very fragile and very dangerous, maybe Blood Angels Captains with Assault Intercessors for a great big damage punch in the Captain's go turn, or squads of Orc Knobs with a War Boss jumping out of a truck or battle wagon, again far more dangerous than they are tough. Usually elites like that tend to make the most sense in transport, though occasionally cheap objective grabber units can be alright. I feel like the ones that actually tend to make use of them in the competitive game are quite commonly ones that can split their squads in half to give you multiple small units of cheap troops, maybe things like Hearthkin Warriors and Sagittars, Cabalite Warriors and Venoms, or the Battle Sister squad in an Immolator, and it seems that all of those examples also have sticky objectives as well, and it can be quite a lot of value to have 2 different sticky objective squads just because you paid for a small capacity transport to break the unit in 2 with its own datasheet rules. On the flip side, units that might not enjoy transports could be big tough things like Custodian Wardens. They're durable enough to take a punch in the first place and can use a Blade Champion to advance and charge and get them across the board dead fast. Perhaps things like regular Space Marine Intercessors, where they're neither so fragile nor so valuable that you really need to invest to get them where they need to go. You might just be better off taking more squads of them rather than transports. or World Eaters 8 bound, which already move quite fast, and particularly with the stratagems that they can get, putting them in a Land Raider feels like a bit of a waste of investment, when they could just hurtle across the board, jumping from cover to cover. In any case though, even though there's plenty of units that don't really want to transport, there's still loads out there that can make really efficient use of them, and often get them in competitive lists. Let's focus on the actual rules for transports though, and go through how they work in 10th edition 40k. Transports all have a transport capacity telling you exactly which models are allowed to embark. Normally this Land Raider can have 12 Astartes infantry models, with Terminator and Gravis models and a few others taking up 2 slots, and other armies might have restrictions on what sort of things can embark. Say for example a Chaos Rhino not transporting jump packs or Terminators. If there's enough room within the transport, you can have multiple different units embarked at the same time, so say you could have 2 squads of 5 with the Land Raider, and Games Workshops often set it up, say in transport capacities of 12 or 6 or 7, so there's usually enough space now to embark an entire squad there and then also have an attached character along for the ride. When vehicles have transport capacity, you can choose to set things up in there, though you do have to make the decision before you've actually put the transport vehicle down anywhere. You can't just do it when they're set up, and you're supposed to do it in the declare battle formation step, the same time as you choose when you put things in reserves. I feel like most of the time you're going to have a battle plan as to know exactly what's going to go in each transport each game. Some armies with big flexible ones, and multiple units that could both profit from going in a transport could be interesting enough to mix around from game to game though. Maybe say if you had a big unit of anti-tank shooting things, it might make more sense to get where they need to be in a repulsor if you happen to be playing a tank heavy list, as opposed to if you're playing say all infantry hordes. Putting them in that tank might not matter that much. You can then also put the entire bundle into strategic reserve if there's enough points cost allowance, so you could have the entire thing arrive from reserves. For most big battle tanks and things that just happen to have a transport capacity, you don't necessarily have to put anything inside them. But if you've chosen to include dedicated transports in the army list, like say Space Marine Rhinos, Impulsors, Sagittors, Necron Ghost Arcs, or Orc Trucks and things, all of those have to start with a unit embarked within them. Otherwise, technically, if you deploy them without, they get destroyed at the start of the first battle round, which isn't going to make most sense for the controlling player. That does make me wonder a bit if anyone's been sad enough over the course of 10th edition to try and gotcha someone with that rule who forgot to put something in a dedicated transport vehicle. Dedicated transports do get the benefit of being able to take up to 6 copies of them, so basically the same as troops provided you've got something inside of them, and the thing that goes in them doesn't necessarily have to be a particularly normal choice as well, provided it's some sort of infantry model that can fill up the capacity. Even something like a lone character could fit the bill. Say for example, earlier in the edition I did see a few people using the Grimnir for the Leagues of Votan to go in a Sagittor, as he could be an interesting little cheap unit to fill one up if it made sense for army construction, if you couldn't quite stretch to another unit of Hearthkin to break up into 5s. For the most part, their rules work like every other unit in Warhammer 40k. The biggest differences come to things like embarking, disembarking, and firing deck. If you've got a unit that wants to get into a transport, they have to move all their models to within 3 inches of its base or hull. For this one, they don't need to be wholly within that area, so as per Games Workshop's diagram here, those Terminators can be partially within that area, and provided every model is just towing into 3 inches, they can embark on that Land Raider, and can move there with a normal advance or fallback move, so potentially you could bail out of combat and get into a big scary tank to keep them safe. For embarking units, the transport's movement is completely independent of units that happen to get into it. If you've had a unit that's jumped in the transport, that transport can then go on to move, and the transport could move or advance before units even got into it. So you could have a Rhino come screeching out from behind terrain or something and have some Marines jump in. Disembarking's maybe got a bit more subtleties. You can't both disembark and embark in the same turn to start with, it's one or the other. I'm presuming you're allowed to. When units disembark, they must get out wholly within 3 inches, so for this one you're not allowed to have your base partially within, it's got to be the entire part of the entire model's base or within 3. So it basically means a unit can kind of gain up to 3 inches movement out of that transport. You've also got to set them up not within any range of engagement range of enemy models, and if you can't set up with both of those criteria, then you can't get your unit out at all. That's going to be at least fairly rare, but can happen from time to time if you've say got a big squad and your opponent's surrounded your transport in melee or something. If the transport hasn't moved before disembarking, the unit that's got out can basically act completely normally, so they turn up within 3 inches of the transport, and they're able to move, shoot, and charge if they'd like to. And that is quite powerful, basically having the extra 3 inches to their movement to get across the table and into the enemy. Then the transport could go and move wherever it likes, maybe going up with them or going off to an objective or something. If the transport has already moved in this phase though, then the options become quite a lot more limited. If the transport itself has either advanced or made a fallback move, then units can't get out of it, they're not able to disembark this phase. So you couldn't, say, have a Hecaton land fortress that was locked in close combat, fall back and then get some Ironir Hearthguard out of it. They'd have to stay embarked if that was happening. And it means that you can't just advance your transport and just sacrifice all the shooting for extra movement and then disembark, unless your transport has a special rule that allows it, like the Taurox. Even if it made a normal move, the unit that got out of it isn't able to move any further or make a charge. It's basically going to mean that your transport vehicle moves, say, 12 inches up the board, the unit gets out 3, and then it'll likely be making shooting attacks and maybe having set up shop on an objective as the main gain of value, but you're not going to move any further or do any charging this turn. Again, there's special rules that can allow that, such as the Land Raider and its assault ramp. I think it wasn't really enormously clear from the rules at the start of the edition, but in the designer's commentary they very explicitly said that transports are allowed to allow you to disembark after they've arrived from reserves, and basically a transport that's arrived from either strategic reserves or deep strike will allow you to disembark, but has the same reserves restrictions of having to set up anywhere that's greater than 9 inches away from enemy models. It means that you could have a transport turn up on the flanks, ditch an infantry unit out, and then everything shoots at some enemies. Though I feel like for most armies, most of the time that will be a bit of a waste, given that with the transport vehicle that you're taking, you're sort of already paying points to have the unit move faster and get to where it needs to go, and also have a bit of sturdy protection. If you're putting the whole thing into strategic reserve, you're kind of just doubling down on having the same thing. The unit could go into strategic reserve all by itself and basically guarantee that it's going to turn up to fight without getting shot and in a fairly threatening position. So for most transports I wouldn't bother. Certain ones can be okay though, like say the Falcon Grav tank delivering some fire dragons. That's a bit nicer as it can deep strike anywhere and actually buff their shooting, so it can drop them down with quite a punch. You're also not allowed to get units out of transports if they've arrived from rapid ingress too. It's just from arriving from reserves in a more normal way. When disembarking, there's sometimes some confusion as to where to measure from, and typically for vehicles without a base, everything counts, so measuring 3 inches from any part on the vehicle. For vehicles with a base, you'd measure to the base if it's either a walker or an aircraft transport, like say a Gorkanaut or a Storm Raven. But if it isn't one of those classes, like say this Drukhari Raider, you measure to whichever bit is closest, either the base or the hull of the vehicle, and that includes all the spiky bits and stuff like the prong out the front, which does feel a bit weird and counterintuitive, but certainly means that that can be a bit of a staging point for Drukhari things getting out the front of the thing. Finally, for disembarking things, you'd also have to get out if the transport's destroyed. So say you had a unit of Space Marines inside an Impulsor and the Impulsor gets destroyed, you basically immediately have to disembark them, and when you do so you have to get the models out before you've actually removed the transport vehicle, so putting them around it somewhere within that 3 inches as normal, before you go on to roll Deadly Demise and take the transport off the board. It means that you can't really put the models directly under where the transport was, even if it is very shortly to be removed. The unit that's got out of a transport might have the chance to take a few mortal wounds, though it doesn't get affected by the vehicle's deadly demise if it goes off. Instead you roll 1 dice per model embarked on the transport, and for each one that unit takes a mortal wound, meaning that for 1 wound models you might lose around about 1/6 of the unit, and for multi-wound models it'll be even less. It's not really the biggest thing in terms of causing casualties typically. On top of the mortal wound damage, the unit also gets battle shocked until the controlling player's next command phase. Usually that's not normally the biggest deal in the world, given that you normally get shot down in the opponent's turn, so it's only going to be for the rest of the opponent's turn that you can't use stratagems and things, and then it won't matter after that, and you still will be able to score any objectives that you happened to disembark onto. If the transport was destroyed in your turn somehow, like say a hazardous check perhaps, or the enemy overwatching it, then that could actually be quite a lot more impactful. You might not be able to contest objectives against the opponent grabbing them, and you're also prevented from charging that turn too. I guess that bit's to prevent you sort of gaming being able to make a charge by destroying a transport in some unlikely way. Basically having the transport blown up isn't usually going to advantage the troops in terms of them being able to act or do more. Finally, for disembarking for destroyed transports, there's the emergency disembarkation rule. This one only applies if you can't get your unit out anywhere within 3 inches of the transport and not within engagement range. I guess most typically because you're surrounded by enemy units. If that's the case, then instead you can disembark anywhere within 6 inches, which is really quite a big area of the board at this point, but instead of taking mortal wounds on a roll of a 1 for each model, it's on a 1, 2 or 3 instead, so that's going to be a lot more damage to the squad. If you run out of room for models that you're able to deploy, then any further ones are destroyed. That's going to be pretty rare to happen though, maybe very occasionally for massive transports like Orcs and a battle wagon perhaps. Otherwise, besides the embark and disembark rules, the other major rule that transports have is the firing deck. basically representing the unit taking some pot shots out of the transport's top hatch or similar. Plenty of transports can basically have everyone fire out as well. I think this one's perhaps one of the more frequently misplayed ones at more casual levels, just as it's weirdly fiddly and not really super intuitive. The way it works, rules as written, is that it's the transport that counts as being equipped with one weapon profile from each model that's allowed to shoot with a unit embarked. So it maybe helps to think as the transport basically having those guns bolted onto it, as opposed to actually being the squad inside firing, as that's what's happening mechanically. It means that you use everything that's on the weapon profile of the unit within, such as say the ballistic skill and anything like twin linked or devastating wounds that's written on the weapon profile, but you wouldn't get any boosts from any datasheet abilities or any attached characters, so you couldn't say have a Space Marine Lieutenant give that shooting lethal hits. It does mean that the shooting will get any buffs that the transport itself had, so say if you had a Tech Marine give an Impulsor a +1 to hit, that would confer to the ballistic skill 3+ weapons of the Space Marines that were in theory firing out of it, and if the weapons have the hazardous special rule as well, again it's the transport that counts as firing the guns, so it'll be the transport that takes the 3 mortal wounds if you fail any hazardous checks. In practice, it often means that you can get a little bit more shooting out of a transport with these rules, though typically it's not going to be quite as efficient as if the squad's out and about, as it means that you can't use stratagems to affect the squad shooting in itself, and synergies for the transport vehicles shooting buffs tend to be far more limited in quite a lot of armies and detachments. Because of a fair few rules weirdness bits that come with the transport technically being equipped with the weapons, Firing Deck does have a bunch of quirks and did attract quite a lot of things in that designer's commentary document. First up, it's definitely worth being aware that Firing Deck can't be used for Overwatch, it only applies in your own shooting phase by the core rule. I feel like that will be quite an easy one to misplay, so worth catching your opponent if they try and do that. You can't use one-shot weapons out the top of them, such as Genestealer Cult demo charges. They just decided to completely ban that from being able to happen, to prevent the rules weirdness of basically the transport having fired a one-shot weapon that it no longer has anymore, but the squad inside technically not having fired it, even if I feel like the common sense solution would have just been to count the weapon as expended from the squad within. Otherwise, they specify that you can't use it to shoot with a unit that's already fired this phase, even if that unit was out of a transport and then embarked in the transport. Eliminators are able to do that as they can shoot and then make a further normal move which they can use to embark in an Impulsor, and before they patched this it meant that they could take a second round of shooting out of it, but weirdly it can also allow certain units to shoot when they otherwise wouldn't be able to. So say you had a unit that was in melee and engagement range, it fell back and got into the transport. Normally when falling back you wouldn't be able to shoot, but because the unit's got into the transport and is now using the Firing Deck, it's the transport that counts as being equipped with the weapons. That means that you can blaze away with those guns that otherwise wouldn't have been able to shoot if the unit couldn't embark. That one's kind of a niche one, but can rarely be a way to keep guns firing that otherwise wouldn't be able to. Finally, beyond Firing Deck, there's one other small but big rules thing that has quite a big impact for transported units, and that's that while a unit is embarked in a transport, units can't use their datasheet abilities, enhancements, or be targeted with stratagems, and weirdly this is about the most restricted state that units get in Warhammer 40K, as some datasheet abilities can still function when the unit's off in reserve, but plenty of those same ones can't be used when they're in a transport, basically unless there's something that very specifically spells it out, such as Kabbalite warriors getting their sticky objectives while they're in a raider. Otherwise datasheet abilities are turned off, so Asrael isn't going to be generating a command point when he's in a repulsor, and he can't activate the command phase buff that is Pedro Cantor's big +1 attack when he's embarked in a Rhino or a Land Raider. It can make certain units really quite bad synergies with transport vehicles like both of those, and one recent example where it was a big deal was the Orc War Boss, who Games Workshop technically ruled that he couldn't use his War ability to gain a whole bunch of extra attacks while he was embarked in a transport vehicle, which just felt very weird and arbitrary and made him far harder to use, but they patched it away by changing how the ability would work as opposed to the core transport rules. As mentioned, this does also apply to Firing Decks as well. Again, no datasheet abilities or buffing rules on that one, so no Lieutenant lethal hits or inbuilt squad datasheet rerolls affecting their shooting. One of the only core exceptions to that is the Scouts rule, where this one is allowed but only in a slightly restricted set of circumstances. Every single model within the transport has to have the Scouts keyword, and the transport vehicle itself must be a dedicated transport, not just anything that happens to have a transport capacity like a Land Raider or a Land Fortress. And if both of those things are true, then you can make the Scout move that the unit inside would have been able to make. Generally this one's pretty powerful, and it means that a unit with a whole bunch of movement can get into the midfield dead early. The Guard quite like it with maybe Kaschan jungle fighters or Cadian Kazakin in Chimeras or Tauroxes, The Leagues of Votann definitely enjoy their scouting transport vehicles, though for them it's the Sagittor that has the scout keyword, and having a unit of Hearthkin warriors or something embarked inside it certainly doesn't prevent it using that. Finally, just to round up the transport core rules, there's a couple more niche things. Sometimes units disembarking out of a transport can cause a bit of confusion as to how they work. Basically, when units get out, they count as having made a normal move for their own purposes, but not for triggering enemy rules. So say if an impulsor moved up, a unit got out and it was in range of 9 inches of some Tyranid termagants. If the impulsor was outside of 9 inches and the squad that disembarked was within 9 inches, you still wouldn't trigger the termagant's reactive move, as the unit that's just been set up on the board hasn't actually made a normal move or anything that's ended within that 9 inches. They've just been set up there. If that same impulsor hadn't moved though and the squad had just got out normally, they would still have to go on to make a normal or advanced move. They have 2 rules as written, and that subsequent move might trigger reactive abilities. And also bear in mind that this whole thing doesn't apply to Overwatch either, as well as all the movement stuff. Overwatch has a specific thing saying that it can trigger for units that have just been set up, whether it's reserves or jumping out of transports. Lastly, they also have a stipulation for disembarking large models, maybe say Dreadnoughts or Ghazghkull Thraka that might not be able to fit wholly within 3 inches of a transport space. They just added a quality of life improvement for them, saying that if they're too big to fit within that range, you can just put them anywhere within 1 inches of the base or hull, I guess technically gaining a little bit more positioning advantage there. Overall, I feel like maybe the top line things of transports are fairly obvious, but there's actually a surprising amount of niche things and edge cases and rules that can occasionally interact kind of weirdly due to the different movement things that they create and the sort of off-the-board states that units get when they're inside them. In any case, we're trying to use those rules practically in the game. As mentioned, typically transports are going to want to have something scary inside them, powerful units in their factions that can deal a lot of damage, usually up close, but are going to be worried about getting shot up by enemy guns if they just try to walk across the board with their bad defensive profiles. Perhaps one typical example of a unit in a transport like that could be a Chaos Lord with some Chosen in a Chaos Rhino. A really scary melee unit that wants to be jumping into combat with the enemy's scariest stuff and hopefully laying it low for the glory of the Dark Gods. For deploying the transport vehicles, in general it's going to be a balance between trying to keep them hidden from enemy heavy firepower, but also deploying them pretty far forward to try and get them where they need to be. As often with 40k deployment, it's going to be a bit of a trade-off. In some games it might make more sense to play cagey. In other games, if the opponent doesn't have that much long-range fire support, you might be able to be a bit more brave, or it might make sense just to try and overload the enemy with targets. So hopefully this Rhino gets ignored amongst all the other threats out there. When you've set up, if the enemy goes first and gets first turn and pushes up into the midboard, your unit might want to just get out of the transport straight away, disembark as far out the front as they can with that extra 3-inch move essentially, then move up the board, use their advance and charge as they're able to do that, and between the transport boost, the advance and charge, and their normal movement and their charge rolls, on average you should engage units that are around about 20 to 21 inches away. If you're rolling average, that's really quite a big threat range, and even just having a transport vehicle on the board to threaten that means the opponent would have to think very carefully about what sort of units they put within that range. If you get first turn on the other hand, then they're probably not going to be making a charge right from turn 1. I feel like often the play might be there to move the transport up into the midfield, ideally behind cover or in terrain, or at least right next to it, still keeping the unit safe behind some annoying adamantium that the opponent won't want to chew through, and then having the unit in an even more super threatening position turn 2, to the point where bad things are going to happen if they're ignored. That'll be a melee example, but it's kind of similar for shooting units. I think more typically for them though, it's more often going to be the transport actually moving and then making the 3-inch drop out the front. Say for example a Tower Devilfish moving up to the midboard and dropping some breaches there, hopefully getting them within range of an objective marker, and then shooting anything else on that marker into oblivion with their pulse blasters. Again, that could potentially be a very good thing to do turn 1 if the enemy's moved up with something important, or if there's not going to be anything in strike range that's particularly good to go for, then play a bit more conservatively and move up and save the big punch for the next turn. If transports are going to move up into the midboard, again ideally you'd usually want to be hiding what you can, but in reality not everything is usually going to be able to hide safe and sound and out of enemy gun sight. At least for transport vehicles, they should probably be a top priority to at least get near to a line of sight blocking ruin, even if the transport itself might still be exposed. Basically this can mean that you have a lot more options when the transport gets destroyed and the unit has to get out, potentially being able to disembark safely behind terrain. For example, this raider's full of Cabalite warriors and has moved up onto the midboard objective to use its sticky objective rule. The Cabalite warriors and the raiders took some pot shots at exposed enemies, making use of the transport's firing deck. If the enemy then turns their guns on the raider, it's deliberately aligned itself so it's right up against that ruined wall. The idea being that there's going to be enough space within that 3-inch drop zone to be able to get the entire squad out, safe and sound out of line of sight, but still on the objective marker. So even if the transport is popped, the objective is still yours. You'll be able to sticky objective it in the command phase, and then the Cabalite warriors can even move up and start shooting as well, if that makes sense. The transport's still very much done its job getting them where they need to be, even if it gets destroyed. In general though, if you can't hide them, transports are still quite nice to be able to try and make annoying to kill if it's possible. Generally cover's pretty easy to get in 10th edition, so towing some bit of the transport behind a ruin or something could mean that your opponent has to do more shooting to bring it down, which is always good. And maybe using smoke or other durability stratagems can be fairly good even on a cheap rhino. Again, it might not necessarily save it, but if your opponent has to spend lots of excess shooting to take down a really cheap tank, it's probably not going to be the worst thing. Also, for trying to support your unit that's got out, occasionally transports might be able to soak up a bit of Overwatch. It's far less common or easy than it was back in 9th edition, mainly because you can get Overwatched in the movement phase and not just in the charge phase. But if your opponent does decide to save things to the charge phase, you might well be able to charge with a transport and then lock up the enemy unit that wanted to Overwatch and stop them shooting the unit that got out of it that also follows in with a charge. Again, though a bit niche, and a lot of the time your opponent would have just been fine to Overwatch in the movement phase as normal. After the transport's contents have been dropped out though, its work isn't done. As mentioned earlier, just having a cheap durable expendable unit has loads of value, even if its damage output probably isn't going to be particularly great. Just towing them on to primary objectives is usually not going to be a bad idea, then your opponent has to deal with them more, and might make it just not really worth their time to try and clear off that objective with shooting if they can't get other units to it. As fairly cheap and fairly expendable units, a lot of the time they can be quite nice as doing actions for secondaries to stop your other units having to bother. And just having any unit on the board that's at least somewhat tough can be handy in 40k. They can be used to screen out deep strikers, potentially ranging out on the flanks of the army, or even retreating back into the deployment zone to stop things from landing there once their cargo's got out. That could be good to protect the core of the army, or maybe even stopping the opponent getting into places where they could score secondaries. You could also just move block people in the more traditional sense as well, maybe moving the vehicle into a movement lane so an enemy monster or dreadnought can't get through. Transports are maybe one of the best things for doing nuisance charges with as well. If they've got nothing better to do, then they might as well annoy the enemy ranged units by just charging into combat with them, and then give them a few difficult decisions as to whether or not they bother falling back to get movement and give up shooting, or remain in combat and try and shoot down your vehicle with -1 to hit. It could even be powerful enough against melee units as well, provided you know your transport's going to be tough enough to survive one round. If they have to remain in close combat with you, and it means they can't charge down something far more important next round, then that's going to be pretty bad for them. Occasionally they could also support the assault by charging the same units that you've charged your melee specialists into, perhaps stopping them from piling in how they'd like, so they can't actually have more attacks against your big unit, like this unit of Orc Mega Knobs here. A bit weirdly strung out, and the transports charge one end of them, while the Blade Guard charge the other end of the squad. Only a few Mega Knobs are going to be able to fight those Blade Guards. Any damage they do have certainly can chip in as well. They tend to have at least some guns, maybe good at killing light infantry most typically. And if they're all on their own, and just the death of 1 or 2 light infantry could make a big deal, tank shot could be an option as well. Not really going to be worth it just for general purpose damage output most of the time. But if it made a difference of, say, an opponent losing the control of the objective, then it could be worth a pop. In any case though, that's a whole load of transport tactics all in all. Let me know your thoughts on the unit class down in the comments below. Does your current army make any use of them, or have they been left on the shelf for you? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that links down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.